So we're working our way through this narrative lectionary. And of course, that phrase, narrative lectionary, is somewhat of an oxymoron. I mean, Scripture says all kinds of different things and doesn't just neatly fall into our singular narratives. When we preach, it's fine to get into the fun storytelling of the passage, like the one we just heard, but finding a singular narrative at times may really be something disingenuous. Because it's easy to look for the things you wish you could say about a passage, and again, especially a passage like this one, and then just say those things. But I can't do that here. So bear with me, because I'm actually going to give you a long list of things I wish I could say about this passage, but I can't. And I'll end with a few things that I actually can say about it. So I wish I could say that this story, this passage, is just one of personal failing. But while there is undoubtedly personal failing happening, it's much more about the failing of an entire system. Israel asked for a king to defeat their very real enemies. And Samuel warned them that a king might help them defeat their enemies, but that king would then start to take from them. The king would take their sons and their daughters. The king would take their land and their livestock. The king would take their food and their wine. And that's exactly what David has done here. He takes Bathsheba. He takes Uriah's life. He takes the lives of a lot of innocent people. He takes victory from his own army. As David takes, he's not just failing on some personal level. He's failing in Israel's quest for shalom. And shalom is something that Israel has been after for centuries. And we translate that word as peace, but really it means something much more. It's about the genuine flourishing or even the genuine salvation of an entire people. And as the king takes from his people, he takes away their shalom. I wish I could say this was the only mistake David makes in his life. In fact, the writer of Kings says exactly that. He says, David did not deviate from anything the Lord commanded him throughout his life, except for in the matter of Uriah the Hittite. But the writer of the book of Samuel tells us a vastly different story. I wish I could say that this story came out of the blue. But honestly, David has been on the verge of doing this once before, and at another time he did something quite similar, and both of these occasions netted him wives. Speaking of which, I wish I could go along with this narrative that this is about relational fidelity or relational infidelity. But David had 7 named wives at the time of this incident. So which one of those 7 is he being non-exclusive with here? Or maybe it was one of his many secondary wives or his concubines that he's being unfaithful to. No, David never made any pretenses about doing monogamy. He collected wives for political reasons, and he collected concubines for purposes of pleasure. But he takes Bathsheba here for purposes of power. She's something he cannot have, so he decides he has to have her. Because adultery in that context, in that culture, was based on one simple and sexist notion. That was something involving a married woman. So if Bathsheba had been unmarried, he could have simply swept her into his harem. If Bathsheba had been a prostitute, no one would have batted an eye at him being with her. But she's a married woman, and thus she's understood as something belonging to somebody else. And that's what makes this act punishable by death for David. I wish I could say that Bathsheba was a willing participant in this, but there's nothing in the text to suggest that, unless you feel that taking a bath is inappropriate. But there is a lot in the text to suggest that she has no choice in this. She certainly has no voice, and the writer of this story doesn't give her any agency. She is simply taken by David. And take is indeed the word that is used here. It's the same word that's used at the start of Samuel, the same verb to describe what the king will do to the people, and that's not a coincidence. David sends messengers to take her. Messengers in Samuel were the fiercest and most loyal of soldiers, the ones who could do an unpleasant job. So all the soldiers are out of the city. This includes Bathsheba's husband and her father. They're out fighting David's war. And the only ones left in the city are David and his most loyal soldiers. And that's who he sends to take her. David takes her and uses her and sends her away. I wish I could say that was the end of David's evil in this story, but he's just getting started. Bathsheba sends him word that she is pregnant, and David panics. So he decides to have Uriah recalled from the fighting and tells him to go home and to wash his feet. And yes, that's a euphemism. And no, Uriah doesn't go home and wash his feet, not even when David gets him drunk. So David decides to kill him. I wish I could say that David kills Uriah because he's in the way. But the truth is, David kills a lot of innocent people because Uriah is in the way. He wants to maintain this illusion that he's innocent of this job, so he gives this murder, so he gives the job to Joab, that was his main commander. But David doesn't even let Joab just pull Uriah aside and stab him like he's done before and like he'll do again. Instead, he creates a battle where a lot of people will die and Israel will lose just to get rid of this one inconvenience. And I wish I could tell you that this battle didn't matter. After centuries of being harassed by its enemies, though, David has finally defeated his enemies. And he's down to the last enemy he has. It's the Ammonites, who are the most brutal enemies in the region. And they're pushed back to their very last city. And Israel is finally on the verge of winning peace. And this is the battle that David commands Joab to throw. Is there a greater insult to ask of a commander? Is there anything that's going to be more contrary to defeating your enemies than to start intentionally losing battles? I wish I could tell you that in the passage we read today, when David is confronted by Nathan, when he's confronted about his actions, that he recognizes the very real way that he has hurt people. Yet, while he clearly feels bad about his sin, at no point does he seem to recognize that he has hurt other people. In Samuel, he simply says, "I have sinned against the Lord." And in Psalm 51, and whether or not you believe that's written by David or in his name about this story, he says that it's against the Lord and the Lord only that he has sinned. And that seems a stretch in light of the human carnage that is in his wake. It's as if he views God and God alone as on his level to even be sinned against. I wish I could tell you that David follows his own command and restores what he has taken. But he doesn't restore anything, and not certainly sevenfold, like he said the owner of the sheep had to do. In fact, he manages to make things worse for those he has wronged. After taking Bathsheba by force, after killing her husband, he then makes her come into his home to live with him for the rest of her life. Uriah is dead, and his life can't be restored, and the same thing for countless number of soldiers. And Joab had done David's dirty work, and so how does David repay Joab? When David is on his deathbed, the last thing he does, he calls his son Solomon to him, and he tells him that Joab is a murderer and not to let his gray head go down to the grave in peace. And Solomon starts his reign a lot like Michael Corleone started his, and he does just that. I wish I could tell you that theologically, I'm okay with all the things the writer of Samuel has God say to David, but I'm not. I wish I could tell you that as a king, David learned his lesson and stopped taking from his people. But David goes on to take a census of the entire nation so that he can take fighters into the army and conscription, so that he can continually fight his wars and his own people will die. And this was such an affront that even in Chronicles, and there's no more pro-David book in the Bible than Chronicles, even the writer of Chronicles has to say that this was Satan himself who made David do this. And this escalation and taking is what will forever split the kingdom, and it will happen within 2 generations. And finally, I wish I could tell you that the generations after David learned from his sins, and they got better. But they didn't. They got worse. In fact, the next 7 chapters of Samuel are some really sad chapters that tell about these same sins being committed by and against David's own children. It's thoroughly sad and it's thoroughly heart-wrenching stuff. So what can I say from this thoroughly sad story? What good news is there here? And just 3 things. First, at this thoroughly sad moment in Israel's history, when we see not only very real personal failure, but we also realize that the kings of Israel are going to treat the Israelites a little better than the pharaohs of Egypt. It is precisely at this moment that Yahweh acts. And our passage today starts with these words: "What David had done was evil in the Lord's eyes, so the Lord sent Nathan to David." And everyone in this room probably has a little different understanding of what God is or isn't, how God acts or doesn't act. Whatever the particulars of what God says here, the message is clear. And that's just because Israel has substituted one type of violence for another. It doesn't mean God has abandoned calling Israel to shalom. And if that was true in the saddest of moments, then why wouldn't it be true in all moments? Second, Nathan's response here is clearly profound. I mean, it's certainly brave, because David has just killed an innocent person who was in his way, and a lot of innocent people who wasn't in his way at all. So it's not a stretch to suppose he might kill Nathan here, or maybe even worse. But he has to do something more than simply oppose David. He has to craft a message that David will be able to understand and be changed by. And that's why a prophetic call is so difficult. I mean, no one's a prophet simply by speaking their mind. It requires a mix of truth and an understanding of the hearer, and a significant portion of creativity in order to resonate. And Nathan does this brilliantly. He recognizes that in spite of all the ways David has been corrupted, at his core he is still a shepherd. So he appeals to his shepherdly code, and he tells him a story about just caring for sheep. And it resonates with and even convicts David. And whether or not it actually changed him, what is clear is the brilliance of Nathan's prophetic proclamation. And third, this moment is what really institutes the prophetic tradition in Israel that emerges once the failure of the monarchy is clear. I mean, we're not talking about this story because 3,000 years ago, some king had a personal failing, or abused his people, or sang a song about it. We're talking about this story because Nathan creatively confronts him, and he starts a prophetic tradition that will expand for centuries. And countless prophets will follow in this lead. Indeed, it is the call of prophets to shalom that is the real legacy of Israel. It's not the misdeeds of the kings. And we like to think of Jesus as a descendant of David, but really spiritually, he's much more a descendant of Nathan. Because without that prophetic tradition, there is no Jesus, and there is no us, and there is no First Christian Church in Bloomington, Indiana. We're here because in the saddest moments of Scripture, God resolutely called for peace. We're here because some people not only heard that call, but they were able to creatively convey it to those that needed to hear it. We're here because shalom still matters. And since we're in a time of stewardship here at the church, I want to restate that line, because that's the most compelling stewardship line I know. We are here because shalom still matters.